educational institutions. So that factored into this. And the third source of information for me were reports that I was either given during interviews or people indicated that I should be reading, or independent research that I was doing with respect to the policies coming out of Ottawa, Toronto, and if there were policies locally being developed here. So the first piece on flexibility, what I noted during the interviews were that at the federal provincial level, there's actually a fair degree of flexibility, although there are program constraints on things like LMDAs because of the funding sources that trickle through in terms of eligibility requirements for the individuals that may be receiving those programs locally. But that by and large, locally, programs are administered and delivered, that there's not a lot of program development that's occurring locally in Thunder Bay. So there's not a devolution of authorities and you're working with broad program criteria here that you're adapting to local circumstances. You're by and large putting in place programs that have been developed in Toronto. So that's the first area of flexibility, and so that and probably I should note, there's a tendency when we're looking at these grids to treat them like scores, like we've got, 3.5 out of 5. It's not the way in which these things are actually coded. They're simply, the questions will often have 5 categories, so it's simply reflective of the type of response, and it allows us to do comparisons, for instance, with the areas that we visited in Quebec, or areas that were done in other jurisdictions. So it's simply, it allows us to get a rough sense of where people are responding in those 5 question areas. So in terms of flexibility, the bottom line is that locally here, you're coordinating, you're administering, you're managing, but you're not developing. Capacities within the vocational education and training. This has to do with dollar numbers, financial resources. It has to do with human resources in terms of people numbers as well as people capabilities. What the interviews showed here is that in terms of people capabilities, they're strong, universally strong across all of the areas. People are dedicated, they're well trained. People were signaling to me, though, that they were concerned with workload and stress in the workplace and backup. So that if somebody got sick, it was hard to find someone to replace. So but the quality of the staff was good. Resources were seen as not adequate to fully do the job from a couple of perspectives. One is because the region has a broad population base. There are a lot of remote locations, or locations where in fact it's just very hard to provide a high level of service. And as well in terms of the overall demand, in part because the people who are unemployed in the region, and I think this goes back to what Jonathan was showing on a couple of slides ago, is that the individuals who are job seeking in the region tend to be having a harder and harder time finding work. So as the unemployment rate is declining, the pool of those people looking for work have a rougher time, right? And so that they're requiring more staff time in order to complete a placement. And so the resources aren't expanding, but the degree of difficulty, so to speak, are there. So these were things that were coming out of the interview. And so that was the notion around capacity. Policy coordination and cooperation with other sectors. We were measuring this at 3 levels. So I interviewed all of the federal departments that were involved in policies that would need to be applied locally. So HRSDC, Infrastructure Canada, Immigration Canada, the regional agencies, and Industry Canada. were the departments that I was interviewing at the federal level. By and large, at the federal level, there's the coordination among the ministries is light. So there are more case-specific meetings called for people to get together rather than there being a notion that all of these policies are actually interconnected locally, and there needs to be structure that exists on a permanent basis. The same observation is made in Toronto, that connections between the ministries tend to be ad hoc and purpose-specific rather than there being institutional arrangements which are bringing the departments together on a regular basis. Locally here, there's actually quite a large network of committees and interactions. I think to some extent facilitated because Thunder Bay is a small community and people know each other. As well, there are some structures that have been put in place that allow for meetings. And there's I think a structure in terms of the departments or the ministries. There's a structure for them to get together. There's also a structure for the employment people to be coming together. There's structure for the educators to be communicating and for the economic development to be communicating. If I had an observation locally, the connections, the network connections between those varieties of networks, those three groupings of networks, is still not as strong as it could be. Okay, so that some of the other communities we've seen is that you actually see these strong employment services networks, strong economic development, education, but very strong connections among those. And those tend to be communities where actually we're seeing a fair bit of activity and a fair bit of development. So it would be kind of an area that I could see that there's an opportunity space for Thunder Bay to deepen those connections between those groups. Evidence-based policy making at both the federal and the Ontario level. There's an increasing demand for program accountability and an increasing demand for evidence in support of program results. So that there's a strong sort of evidentiary push. That we see that in terms of the employment services contracts where they're outcome-based contracts. Part of that, I think, is good. There's something I'm trying to wrap my brain around, and that is the notion of what gets measured gets managed. And so in terms of the strong focus on results and results measurement, are there spaces that are starting to emerge that need greater attention? And the example that I'll use here is that because we're moving more into areas where there are supply imbalances. So employers are looking for people with skills and it's hard to recruit in the region. The connections to employers are becoming increasingly important, but it was hard for me to find whether there was specific intent within the series of arrangements to direct contact to those employers and to be working strongly with employers to be connecting with the educational institutions to develop the skills that they needed. So that again, using a specific example, the employment services contract focus on employment placements. So the contacts with employers tend to be around filling job vacancies with individuals who have the skills or near the skills, rather than perhaps a longer-term approach where over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, employers are going to be needing these kinds of skills in order to build their enterprises, and then there's that kind of forward planning that's being fed into the community college, the university, that information becoming part of labor market information. So that's the space, and I'd be interested in a conversation around that. So that's the first thematic area and the preliminary results that I developed. I'm going to stop here so that we can engage a broader conversation about, either what I've just talked about, or if there are things that you're seeing saying like, well, you're missing something, or we need to develop another line of inquiry in order to ensure that the reports work.
That's why you need the action. Those first reports.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This is the first of the 4 quadrants or themes that we're going through. So is the expectation that you'll have some, like obviously if we're looking at rooms for improvement, there are some details beside each of those 4 areas. So is it your plan then to identify in order to increase the capacities within the plan, and that there will be a specific action on that item?
Yeah, so what I was doing was revealing, let's say, on the flexibility piece,
Right.
what it might show up in the report as is that there's good structures to support the accountability and perhaps further devolution of autonomy to the local area. Okay, and here are some of the ways in which it might be effectively used. So that would be the kind of the mix of, because it's, one is the observation saying that programs are largely created in Toronto and Ottawa and then administered locally. Is that optimal or not? There's a leaning based on the study sites that we've seen so far that there's clearly a balance that's needed, but that there is a place for a degree of flexibility locally to adapt to local circumstances. And so I'm coupling that with, do I observe that in fact that there's governance capacity locally to be able to support a strong accountability regime, which would be a necessary condition for further evolution? I'm saying, yes, I see that. And so there's an opportunity space perhaps if ministries want to look at it at either experimenting or doing direct development of increased authorities locally. So that would be an example of where I'm headed. So if I'm wrong on that, then it's really a great time to say whoa. Or if you think that I'm holding back, then that would also be a good discussion.
I guess I'm just thinking at a dashboard, if this is going to demonstrate that opportunity or that alert, then that's a good thing. And as it relates to the employer, you make reference to that final evidence-based policy. And that's one group that I don't know if, as a stakeholder, we capture everything from. You've referenced the studies and the reports that you've gone through, and I'm aspiring that's another group that needs to be engaged.
Yeah. You mean the whole community of people that provide the research that supports policy. And there I would be pointing to things like the creation of the institute, for the Northern Policy Research. So that's a good example of where there's an opportunity space to build evidence that's region specific. Now it's a bit too new because in fact I think the inaugural meeting was February the 20th. That's obviously an opportunity space. Now I'm also going to speak, and I suppose we could, is that when I pulled reports, virtually all of the information that's being locally used is coming from the census long form. So that there's necessarily going to be a highlight that we don't know what the results are going to be at this point of the 2011 census because a different methodology is being used. Will that provide sufficient data for you to be able to continue to develop local information in a way that you can use it effectively is a question mark. Unfortunately, we're going to have the report is probably going to be complete before the jury's in on that. But there's at least kind of a cautionary note because you're already at the margin. Like we use the census metropolitan area simply because if you were using the economic region, most of the data would be suppressed outside of the census metropolitan area. Right, so you already have a data problem because of the small population base. If that's further impacted by the new method of asking questions that are replacing the long form, then it could leave you with a fairly serious problem. That's some of the things that I'm thinking.
I'd just like to make a comment. So these folks as well, because you made a comment about, you know, the demand for for that sort of like outcome measures, that it does help to connect sort of where the needs are, where the shortfalls are, and making sure that the policies sort of match up with that. But delivering services, employment services to people who are on social assistance, who have had, there was not a strong connection to the workforce, and that gap is growing bigger and bigger all the time. When you're looking at making policies that, okay, we need these high-skilled workers in a specific field, so the policies are going to be looking specifically at those being the outcome measures. I feel like a lot of the people that are marginalized, that sort of always seem to fall between the gaps, are those policies don't meet their needs. They get forgotten once again. There's no consideration for the people that need a whole lot more work and a whole lot more support to even get attached to the workforce, let alone even think about post-secondary education to fill in some of these skill sort of shortages. So although outcome measures are good in setting some expectations,